Hello guys. Today we'll be studying about a very important and a very commonly found group or family of bacteria known as family Enterobacteriaceae. So to begin with, we will have many bacteria with most of them you will be familiar with, and all of those bacteria they are going to follow some general family characteristics. So what are they? First of all, they do not take gram stain. They are gram negative and they are rod shaped. So we call them gram negative bacilli. And all the members are negative for the enzyme oxidase and positive for the enzyme catalase. So all the members of this family are negative for oxidase, positive for catalase. There is a single exception for the catalase, that is type 1 Shigella dysentery. So except type 1 Shigella dysentery, all the bacteria in this family will have catalase positive. They are non-fastidious. What do you mean by fastidious and non-fastidious? So if I am telling they are fastidious, they only grow in a medium, or they only grow when there are specific nutrients available. They can't just grow on anything. But Enterobacteriaceae is non-fastidious. They can grow on basic conditions. They can grow on basal medium, okay, with minimum nutritional requirements. They ferment glucose and they reduce nitrate. So please try to remember this general family characteristic so that you can apply them on each bacteria you're going to study. You have already gotten points to write on each bacteria you're going to study. And please remember that there is only one catalase negative Enterobacteriaceae, and that is type 1 Shigella dysentery. Now, speaking about the stars of the family, that are the major members. There are many bacteria that belongs to this family, but we are going to discuss about the main ones, the major ones, which will be asked in our examination. So we can generally just randomly group them into motile as well as non-motile. So if I'm telling motile, there should be flagella. What type of flagellar arrangement is in Enterobacteriaceae? We have we have peritrichous. We have peritrichous arrangement of flagella. That is, a flagella will be present throughout the bacilli. So either they are motile with peritrichous flagella or they are non-motile. Who are the motile members? We have PES, P-E-S, P for Proteus, E for E. coli, S for Salmonella. And remaining bacteria, Shigella, Klebsiella, Yersinia, they are non-motile. So please remember this fact. Plus, whenever we are going to study about a bacteria, what are the headings? What are the main headings that we should keep in mind? We'll have general properties, the selective media used for culture, why they cause the disease, that is a virulence factor produced, what is the disease, that is the clinical features, how can we identify it, lab diagnosis, and of course, how do you treat it. So please keep this 6 points in your mind: general properties, selective media, virulence factors, clinical features, lab diagnosis, and treatment. So the first member of this group, what do we have? We have the famous, the notorious Escherichia coli or E. coli. As shown in this microscopic image, this is a gram-stained image. So obviously, we have already studied all the Enterobacteriaceae. They are gram-negative in nature, and as you can see, they are rod-shaped. No, they are rod-shaped, and they are not taking gram stain. That is, they are not blue in color. They are pink in color. That is, they are gram-negative bacilli. And nearby you can see the picture of Theodore Escherichia, who discovered E. coli. Now, as I've already said, PES, P-E-S, they are motile bacteria, right? And E. coli comes in that group with peritrichous flagella. You can see flagella distributed all around the bacteria. So either they are motile peritrichous or they are not motile. So with peritrichous flagella. Now, so having peritrichous flagella and being a gram-negative bacilli were the general features of E. coli. Now, after general features, we come into the selective media where you can culture them. Actually, there is a very important property known as the ability to ferment lactose. So lactose we all know is a disaccharide, right? And some bacteria can ferment lactose. They are known as lactose fermenting bacteria. They are known as lactose fermenting bacteria. Now, how can we utilize this lactose fermenting bacteria? We can utilize this property in order to identify them. There is a medium known as McConkey agar. There is a medium known as McConkey agar in which if we are culturing a bacterium that can ferment lactose, we will get pink colored colonies. So a lactose fermenting bacteria in McConkey agar will give pink color colonies. So to say most of the Enterobacteriaceae, they are lactose fermenters. That is, they can form pink color colonies in McConkey agar. Now, a specific, a selective medium particularly used for E. coli, we have the eosin methylene blue agar. We have the eosin methylene blue agar. And this agar, if we culture E. coli, we'll get green metallic colonies. As you can see, we'll get green metallic colonies. So please try to remember McConkey agar and eosin methylene blue agar. I don't think so it will be much difficult because the names are already familiar. Now, after general properties, after selective media, we ask why do they create disease? They create diseases because they have got some virulence factors which are toxic to us, right? So it is easy to remember about the virulence factors of this bacteria. So just look, I've given you a picture of E. coli. So let's move from outside to inside. You have flagella. There are antigens in flagella which are known as flagellar antigens or H antigens. They can be virulent. They can be a virulent factor. We have fimbriae. We have fimbriae, antigens in fimbriae. Actually, there is a fimbriae known as P fimbriae. There is a fimbriae known as P fimbriae. This P stands for pyelo. This stands for pylogenic. Okay, this stands for pylogenic fimbriae, which can cause UTIs. Okay, so P fimbriae of E. coli is responsible for the disease urinary tract infection. So it's a virulence factor. Now there is a capsule. Capsule will contain antigen which is known as K antigen. Capsule K. And since it is a gram negative bacteria, compared to peptidoglycan in gram positive bacteria, we'll be having lipopolysaccharide in gram negative bacteria. So lipopolysaccharide will have the O antigen. The O antigen or the somatic antigen, we'll be learning about it. Now we have the cell membrane and also it can produce toxins. So remember there is flagellar or H antigen, there is capsular or K antigen. Since it is a gram negative bacteria, we will be having lipopolysaccharide, that is the O antigen, that is a somatic antigen which is apparently the endotoxin. Okay, then we have the production of exotoxins which you can see here. Now speaking about the virulence factors in detail, the most important is the somatic or O antigen, which is a part of the lipopolysaccharide or the endotoxin. So because of this variation in O antigen, there are more than 170 O serotypes. Then we have already discussed about the flagellar or H antigen. Because of the variation, we have more than 75 H serotypes. Capsular K antigen, we have more than 100 K serotypes. I've already told you there is a fimbriae, a particular one known as P fimbriae. Okay, P stands for pylogenic. So it is associated with the urinary tract infections. So when we are going to study about E. coli, which are creating UTIs, we call them uropathogenic E. coli. We call them uropathogenic E. coli. Okay, and what causes this? This is caused because of the P fimbriae. We have the colonizing factor antigen. We have hemolysins. We have, and already as we spoke about, we have toxins, enterotoxins. So most of the, let me tell what more important point here only, like most of the diseases caused by this Enterobacteriaceae Either they are connected to the gastrointestinal tract infections. They are also found as commensals in our GI tract. They are commensals in our GI tract, as well as they can create UTIs, and in some cases they can also create meningitis if there is sepsis. Now, as I've already said, somatic or O antigen is the most important. It is a part of LPS. It is heat stable. That is, it is not destroyed on boiling. So you get the food poisoning, right? Because of the variation O antigen, more than 170 serotypes are available. And the early ones, that is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., they are normal commensals in gut. And the late of the 170 serotypes, they are pathogenic. And I said O, somatic or lipopolysaccharide, they have the endotoxin-like activity. And we also have a remaining flagellar or H antigen, which is heat labile, unlike the O or the somatic antigen. And we have the capsular or K antigen, which is antiphagocytic. So whenever I'm talking about a bacteria which has a capsule, right? Imagine a bacteria with a capsule. So always it provides four properties. Whenever there is capsule, remember A, V, M, S. So whenever I'm speaking about a capsulated bacteria, there are those four conditions that are always followed because of a capsule. A, V, M, S. A stands for antiphagocytic, right? V stands for virulence factor. M stands for mucoid colonies, and S stands for serotypes. So capsule provides an antiphagocytic effect. It acts as a virulence factor. It helps in the production of mucoid colonies. And because of the variation in the capsular antigen, you have many serotypes possible. Okay, please try to remember this. Now, I already said fimbriae. Flagella is for motility, and the shorter one, fimbriae, is for adhering to the surface of the host cells so that it can infect in a better manner for adhesion. And colony factor antigen, like it is found in enteropathogenic E. coli. That is the E. coli which causes diarrhea and GI tract infections. And there is mannose resistant fimbriae, which is a part of UTIs. And P. fimbriae stands for pyelonephric or pyelogenic. So it is the major causative reason for UTIs in human beings. And when I'm talking about the diseases caused by, we have finished the general properties, we have finished the selective media, we have finished the virulence factors. Now coming to the clinical picture, what kind of diseases is produced by E. coli? I already told you it's either gastrointestinal infection, so we have diarrhegenic E. coli, right? Or it's UTIs, that is uropathogenic E. coli, that is UPEC, UPEC, and it can cause septicemia. So we can see septicemic E. coli that can progress into intra-abdominal abscesses, right? Intra-abdominal abscesses, if you are getting one of the most common reason is E. coli, and you can get meningitis, okay, and many other systemic infections. So one sepsis, it can cause sepsis. Just remember that the two major category other than sepsis is like you have diarrhegenic E. coli, which are causing gastrointestinal tract infections, and you have UTI causing E. coli, that is uropathogenic E. coli. Now, talking about diarrhegenic E. coli, the E. coli which can cause diarrhea, there are 6 types, and please remember, let me just change the color. Please remember the mnemonic PIDA D. PIDA D. So these are the 6. This will give you hint to the 6 diarrhegenic E. coli. So P stands for pathogenic, I stands for invasive, T for toxigenic, H for hemorrhagic, A for aggregative, and D for diffusely adherent E. coli. So we have EPEC, enteropathogenic E. coli, P of Pitta, I, enteroinvasive E. coli, EIEC. Then you have ETEC, enterotoxigenic E. coli, EHEC, enterohemorrhagic E. coli, EAEC, enteroaggregative E. coli, and DAEC, diffusely adherent E. coli. So let me give you hint to like what kind of clinical pictures do they cause. We'll discuss each one of them in detail. So Enteroinvasive E. coli. The name suggests invasion. So we have the gut or the alimentary canal, and this E. coli is going to invade into the epithelium or into the mucosa, submucosa. So gradually there will be erosion of tissue over there along with blood. So it kind of cause diarrhea with blood and pus. So it's kind of dysentery, right? So enteroinvasive E. coli causes blood in stools. Just remember as such. Enterotoxigenic. There is no invasion in the term. There is just toxin production. You will have diarrhea. Enterohemorrhagic will have bloody stools. There will be hemorrhagic colitis. Enteroaggregative. They keep on aggregating and cause diarrhea for long duration. Right? They cause chronic diarrhea. And enteropathogenic. P stands for pediatrics. Just remember P for pediatrics. So they can cause diarrhea in children or in the pediatric age group. Right? We are going to study about each one of them. The most serious out of all is enterohemorrhagic E. coli or EHEC. That is the most important also. Okay. Now we have the first group. We have the first group, that is the enteropathogenic E. coli or EPEC. I told you P stands for pediatric. So it causes pediatric problems, right? It causes infantile diarrhea, which is also known as cholera infantil. So it causes infantile diarrhea. So there is no T, toxin, in the term, right? It's enteropathogenic E. coli. So it doesn't produce any toxins, right? There is no invasive, it doesn't invade into the gut epithelium, so there is no blood in stools. What is important of this enteropathogenic E. coli is that it has something known as the bundle forming pili. It has some pili which is known as the bundle forming pili, which attaches to the gut epithelium and causes effacement lesions. So it produces something known as AE lesions, attachment effacement lesions. It attaches to the microvilli of the intestine and disrupts the function of the villi, right? So this is called AE lesions because of the bundle forming pili, and these bundle forming pili or this AI lesions in general are coded due to LEE gene. So please remember enteropathogenic E. coli. You have the P for pediatric age group. So it causes diarrhea in children, which is known as cholera infantil. There is no toxin in the word. There is no invasive in the word. So it doesn't form bloody diarrhea. It does not produce any toxins also. The characteristic feature is it has a bundle forming pili, because of which it causes attachment effacement lesions caused by the LE gene. Right? Now we have the enteroinvasive E. coli. We have the enteroinvasive E. coli or the EIEC. So speaking about the second member of PIDA-D, that is P for enteropathogenic E. coli, I for enteroinvasive E. coli, EIEC. So I told you all the E. coli are motile by Peritrichus flagella and they ferment lactose. That's why they create pink colonies in the McConkey agar. But we have an E. coli which is non-motile and which does not form pink color colonies on McConkey agar. That is, it is a non-lactose fermenter. So they are not the typical E. coli. So we call them atypical E. coli. So enteroinvasive E. coli, they are atypical E. coli because they are non-motile and non-lactose fermenters and they are not like the rest of E. coli. Okay, fine. And we have the invasive part, I part. So because of the help of, with the help of an antigen known as virulence marker antigen, AG stands for antigen. We have virulence marker antigen, VMA. It invades into the gut mucosa. Because of that, it creates dysentery. Now there is no toxin in the heading, so it does not produce any toxin. So enteropathogenic E. coli or enteroinvasive E. coli, they do not produce any toxin. Okay, they cause dysentery. How is dysentery different from diarrhea? Okay, diarrhea is loose stools, and if we have blood and pus, blood and mucus with it, stool with blood and mucus, we call it dysentery. And why is the blood and mucus coming? Because of the invasion into the intestinal mucosa. So in EIEC we get dysentery. So where else you get dysentery? in Shigella, right? In Shigella dysentery. So they behave, this EIEC, they behave like Shigella. And to mark the invasiveness, we'll do a test known as a Serini test. It's not done now. It used to be done to confirm EIEC. What they do is like we'll have a rabbit. They'll inject this into what the near the eyes of the rabbit, and there will be ulceration near the eyes, and this marks the invasiveness of this EIEC. This is called Serini test, but it's not done usually now because we have concerns regarding rabbits, right? And how will we diagnose? How will we diagnose EIEC? So we have an antigen, which is the virulence marker antigen, which is the reason for this invasive nature of EIEC into the gut mucosa. So we'll do an ELISA for VMA, and we'll get the final diagnosis for EIEC. Now we have PITA. P, pathogenic is over. I, invasive is over. T, enterotoxigenic E. coli. And T stands for traveler's diarrhea. It is the most common cause of traveler's diarrhea. It is the most common cause of traveler's diarrhea. Do you know what is the most common parasitic cause? It is Giardia. So Giardia is the most common parasitic cause for traveler's diarrhea, but overall the most common cause for traveler's diarrhea is enterotoxigenic E. coli. And there is no invasive in the heading, right? So it's not invasive. There is no blood and stool, blood and mucus in the stool or in the diarrhea. And it is toxigenic. It produces toxin. It produces toxin. And the common serotypes under enterotoxigenic E. coli, we have the O6, O8, O15, O25, O159, etc. So these are the common serotypes. And why do we see this variation? It's because of the O antigen. We said because of the variation in the O or the somatic antigen or the lipopolysaccharide or the endotoxin, we have more than 170 serotypes, right? So out of those 170 serotypes, the ones associated with ETEC or traveler's diarrhea are the ones given here. Now it produces toxin from the heading itself. It produces a heat stable toxin, that is which does not get destroyed on boiling, and we have a heat labile toxin or heat sensitive toxin. So how do they act? How do they cause diarrhea? How do they cause increased secretion? It's by increasing the cyclic AMP or the cyclic GMP levels. That is fine. The only question is, stable is associated GMP or AMP, labile is associated with GMP or AMP. So remember Los Angeles, a city in America. So you have LA. So labile is associated with cyclic AMP increasing, right? And the other way, GMP is with stable. So just remember LA, Los Angeles, right? And it attaches to the intestinal mucosa by the means of colonization factor antigen, which we've already studied in the virulence factors, right? So now we have PITA, PITHA. So H stands for enterohemorrhagic E. coli. H, it's the most dangerous, and it is the most serious one, and it is the most important one also for us to study. So we have EHEC. So speaking about the EHEC, which serotype of E. coli is associated with this EHEC? Because of the somatic antigen, there is variation. So we have O157 and flagellar antigen H7 serotype. This name of serotype is very, very, very important. So you have the O157 H7 serotype, which causes enterohemorrhagic E. coli associated diarrhea. So as the name suggests, hemorrhagic, the manifestation will be bleeding. There will be blood in stools, right? That is hemorrhagic colitis. There will be hemorrhagic colitis or bloody diarrhea, as the name suggests. And these EHEC, they produce a toxin. They are toxin mediated. They produce a toxin known as verocytotoxin. Verocytotoxin, which acts like Shiga toxin of Shigella. This is a cytotoxin. It goes and inhibits the 28S ribosomal RNA. which is apparently the peptidyl transferase enzyme, which helps in transpeptidation of protein synthesis. So it will decrease protein synthesis. It will decrease protein synthesis. So it is a very toxic toxin. We have virocytotoxin, which is like Shiga toxin, inhibiting the 28S rRNA, that is a peptidyl transferase enzyme of the host, decreasing protein synthesis. We have two types of Shiga toxins. We have Shiga toxin 1 and Shiga toxin 2. And the Shiga toxin 1 is more like the verocytotoxin 1 and the verocytotoxin 2. And the verocytotoxin 1 is more like the Shiga toxin, right? And there is a very important feature. This has very low infective dose. It like 10 to 100 bacteria can cause the disease. This is also seen. The same property of very low infective dose is also seen in the case of Shigella, right? And this is commonly associated with beef consumption or ham consumption, right? And it also causes hemorrhagic uremic syndrome. The toxin 2 causes hemorrhagic uremic syndrome, and basically this hemorrhagic uremic syndrome is a triad. So it is a triad where we have renal failure, we have MAHA, microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, and thrombocytopenia. So renal failure, microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, and thrombocytopenia. This triad is known as hemolytic uremic syndrome caused by EHEC, that to which strain? O157H7 strain, due to consumption of ham, due to virocytotoxin, looks like Shiga toxin. It causes decreased protein synthesis, causing hemorrhagic colitis and hemolytic uremic syndrome. Now, how do we diagnose this EHEC? Apparently, they do not ferment sorbitol. Remaining all E. coli, they ferment lactose, they ferment sorbitol, except the atypical E. coli, of course, the EIEC. Since they do not ferment sorbitol, if we take sorbitol McConkey agar, since they do not ferment, there will be no color formation. So the colonies will be pale, and the diagnosis is made EHEC. So in sorbitol McConkey agar, if we are not getting any colored colonies, we are getting pale colonies, it is EHEC. And in rainbow agar, we'll get black colonies. And we know there is a virocytotoxin. So if you are able to show or demonstrate the cytotoxicity of this virocytotoxin in the viro cell line, fine. And finally, you can always do ELISA and PCR. Sorry. Now speaking about Pitta, P, pathogenic is over, I, invasive is over, T, toxigenic is over, H, hemorrhagic is over, A, enteroaggregative E. coli. They aggregate in a stacked brick-like pattern, like stacked brick. They aggregate and they cause chronic diarrhea. Diarrhea. And this aggregation is due to aggregative adhesion Fimpreae 1 coded by the AGGR gene, and they also produce a toxin known as enteroaggregative stable toxin 1 or EAST1. Speaking about diffusely adherent E. coli, the last Pitta D, the last one. So they diffusely, as the name suggests, they diffusely adhere to the Hep2 cell line. They have diffuse adherence Fimbriae. They cause diarrhea in children of 2 to 6 years age group. So we have completed the diarrhegenic E. coli, right? Finally. Now, after diarrhegenic E. coli, we come into the urinary tract infection. So those E. coli which causes the UTI, they are known as uropathogenic E. coli or the UPEC. They are known as the UPEC. And you know, most of the UTI, almost 70 to 75% of the UTI is created by E. coli. It may be ascending or descending. What do you mean by ascending? Right? You get the infection through the urethra, ascending upwards. What is descending? There is a systemic infection going on in your body, and via blood it disseminated into the kidney, causing pyelonephritis. Then it into the bladder. So it's more of an descending route, and the ascending route is via the urethra. So in the ascending route, you will get cystitis and urethritis. In the descending route, that is a hematogenous spread, and then coming into the kidney, moving downwards, you will get a pyelonephritis. And you can classify them as upper and lower UTI. So upper UTI is, there is a systemic infection through the blood, it is coming to the kidney, then it is descending into the bladder and so on. This is the upper UTI, right? Lower is if it is coming through the urethra going to the bladder this way. That is the lower UTI. Now, there is apparently a table given in Apurva Shastri differentiating the upper and lower UTI. Let's see it. So, lower UTI, bladder and urethra are involved. Upper UTI, kidney and ureter is involved. And in lower UTI, there will be localized symptoms, right? There will be painful urination, that is dysuria, increase in urgency and frequency of urination. These are localized symptoms, just localized to what your urethra and bladder. Now, in upper UTI, since it's coming as a systemic infection into the kidney, you'll have a generalized, local and systemic manifestations such as fever will be there, vomiting will be there, abdominal pain will be there. Route of spread is ascending. Upper UTI may be both ascending and descending, though common is ascending. The lower UTIs are more seen. And the reason why we get UTI, we've already spoken about the P. fimbriae of E. coli, right? The pyelonephric fimbriae of the E. coli. So that causes the lower UTI. So this was about the difference between the upper and lower UTI. Now, what predisposes for getting an urinary tract infection? Females. Why females? Because they have shorter urethra, more close to the outside exterior, more chance of getting an infection. And if there is any urinary obstruction, there will be retention of urine that site, favoring more bacterial growth, predisposing to a urinary tract infection. And what if this urinary obstruction is caused by something physiological, something growing inside, maybe a growing uterus, having a fetus inside? So pregnancy is a natural state, a physiological condition where a physiological obstruction is there, predisposing to UTI. That's why in OBG cases you can see like in pregnancy UTIs are more common. We often ask it in the history also in T1 T2. Now, speaking about the lab diagnosis of uropathogenic E. coli, obviously the specimen that we are going to test will be urine, right? The specimen that we are going to test will be the urine. What urine? The clean, voided, midstream urine, or if the patient is in coma, or we have babies, right? So it is more difficult to achieve urine passively. So we actively take it outside by the means of suprapubic aspiration. But do we do it in the case of patients in coma and also in infants? Now, if there is a catheter, if the person is catheterized and you have to take the urine from such a patient, we don't prefer the urine which is there in the bag. We'll take it from the catheter. Then what do we do with this urine? We can do a direct examination of the urine. We can do a culture to see if there is any bacterial growth, and we can also do antibody-coated bacterial test. Now, what comes under the direct examination? You got a specimen, that is your urine, which may be a clean, voided one, or an actively aspirated suprapubic aspiration in coma or infants, or you took it from the catheter. You can do either a direct examination, you can go for a culture, and you can have an antibody coated bacterial test. So what do you do in a direct examination? We can do a wet mount examination you can watch it under microscope. You can do a Catley's test to see whether it is Catley's positive or negative. Right? We have Catley's positive organisms, as we can classify them as E. coli, right? And you can have a leukocyte esterase test. You can have a nitrate reductase test, which will be positive, as we have already discussed in the family characteristic. This will be positive for Enterobacteriaceae, right? We can do a gram staining, but gram staining is not much helpful because in the urine you can't get that many bacteria, right? So this was about direct examination. Now we'll go to the culture. For culture, we generally said E. coli. We use McConkey agar to demonstrate the pink colonies, showing that they are lactose fermenting. We also use TMP agar. But for uropathogenic E. coli, what we use is the CLED medium. We use the CLED medium. What is CLED medium? C4 cysteine, L4 lactose, E4 electrolyte, D4 deficient. So it is cysteine, lactose, electrolyte deficient medium or agar. Now we cultured there. We got some colony counts. You got a specific number of bacteria growing in that colony. And how to say if the number is significant or not? How to say if the person is suffering from a UTI or not? For that, we have some criteria known as the CAS criteria. So obviously, this is based on the colony count. Now, I've made an image for you to understand CAS criteria. So let me just zoom in. So if it is more than 10 raised to 5 bacteria per ml of urine, even though the individual does not show any localized or systemic symptoms, he is asymptomatic. But the count is more than 10 raised to 5 per ml, it is significant. And in symptomatic people, that is a person is showing fever, dysuria, and all those symptoms which you can associate with a UTI, and he is having 10 raised to 2 to 10 raised to 4 or more bacteria per ml of urine, it is significant. There is a patient who is on antibiotics, and in suprapubic aspiration we are getting less than 2 bacteria, 10 raised to 2 bacteria per ml. The person is on antibiotics. We have took the suprapubic aspiration. Even though he is on antibiotics, you are getting such count, less than 10 raised to 2 bacteria. It's not supposed to be there. So that is also significant. So CAS criteria is pretty much important. So let's just summarize the criteria. More than 10 raised to 5 bacteria per ml of urine, asymptomatic patient, significant. Greater than 10 to power 2, 10 to power 4 per ml, symptomatic patients, significant. The person is on antibiotics. We have done a suprapubic aspiration. We are getting, still he is on antibiotics, still we are, even though he is on antibiotics, you are getting a count of less than 10 power 2. It's significant. Now that was direct examination. We did a culture. Now we'll go for antibody coated bacteria test. So initially we have spoken about the upper UTIs and the lower UTIs, right? So speaking about the upper UTIs, they commonly come as an infection from the systemic infection. By the blood it reaches the kidney and causing pyelonephritis. So already the the pathogen has been in the blood of the patient, unlike like ascending UTI, right? So there are antibodies coated in the bacteria and which could be detected by the means of immunofluorescence. Because it was a systemic infection and reached the urinary tract by the means of hematogenous routes, already there are antibodies which are coated on the antigens which could be detected by the means of immunofluorescence. But in lower UTI, where it's coming through the urethra, ascending upwards, will there be any antibodies? No. So in lower UTI, there will be no antibodies. So you can differentiate between an upper UTI and a lower UTI by the means of antibody-coated bacteria test. What's the treatment? So there is a huge table I've given you, which is the pharmacology actually, and we no need to pay attention into it. But since it will be useful for you guys, so I've just incorporated that table over here. So generally, what we use for treatment, we'll take a beta-lactam, which is actually a cell wall inhibitor, plus a beta-lactamase inhibitor. Basically, like most of the many bacteria have developed resistance against the beta-lactams because of the enzyme they are producing beta-lactamase, right? So basically, like penicillinase. So basically, we'll use an inhibitor and a beta-lactam together. Now, why that? Generally, urinary antiseptics, they act on acidic pH urine. There are categories which act on acidic pH urine, on alkaline pH urine, or whether it is acidic or alkaline, they'll act. So which according to you is the better category of drugs? Independent of pH. Okay, if they're acting independent of pH, they are better. You can see ampicillin, amoxicillin, which are actually they are extended spectrum penicillins belonging to the class amino penicillins, right? So that is a beta lactam. If you are using along with them beta-lactamase inhibitor like clavulanic acid, sulbactam, they are the best categories of drugs used for UTI. That is, the best treatment of UTI is beta-lactams with beta-lactamase inhibitor. You have amoxicillin and clavulanic acid, ampicillin and sulbactam. You can have piperacillin and tazobactam also, right? So these combinations are the best treatment. So that completes our E. coli. So E. coli, I guess, was a largest portion to be covered under the topic Enterobacteriaceae in this lecture. So E. coli is pretty important. Please remember the classification PITA-D: enteropathogenic E. coli, enteroinvasive E. coli, enterotoxigenic E. coli, enterohemorrhagic E. coli, enteroaggregative E. coli, and diffusely adherent E. coli. And out of this, enterohemorrhagic E. coli was the most important guy, causing the hemolytic uremic syndrome and hemorrhagic colitis. Please remember the strain O157H7, which is associated with causing enterohemorrhagic E. coli associated diarrhea, right? So the next member of Enterobacteriaceae is Shigella. Shigella. Okay, already I've given a picture of Shigella, a gram-stained Shigella. They are gram-negative bacterium. We already know that. And if you just zoom in, you can see they are bacilli, right? They are bacilli. So, and they are pink in color, not blue in color. So they are gram-negative in nature. So in Shigella, what are the species? We have Shigella dysenteriae, Shigella flexneri, Shigella boydii, Shigella soni. Also, we can name them as Group A, Group B, Group C, Group D, respectively. Okay, Shigella dysenteriae, flexneri, boydii, and soni. Actually, the Shigella soni one is the most common worldwide. So this is epidemiology. It causes the most infections worldwide. Shigella soni. In India, we have Shigella flexneri. The most important one we are going to study is about Shigella dysenteriae. What was the peculiar character of type 1 Shigella dysenteriae? It does not behave according to the family in one property. They are catalase negative. Type 1 Shigella dysenteriae are catalase negative, whereas the entire Enterobacteriaceae is supposed to be catalase positive. So that was an exception, which we already discussed in the beginning of the chapter. So it is the most common agent causing bacillary dysentery. So to understand the pathogenesis, I've made a small diagram. So please see here. So while we are consuming food and other materials contaminated with Shigella bacteria, we get the infection. That is the mechanism of transmission is fecal-oral route. Now it is coming through the esophagus into the stomach. We have got many Shigella bacilli over there. Now automatically there is our innate immunity. Our HCl is secreted, but Shigella is not sensitive or resistant to HCl. They are acid resistant. That's why even 100 or 10 to 100 bacteria can cause the infection. That is, it has a low infective dose. Where else did we study this? We also studied this in the case of enterohemorrhagic E. coli. We said they are similar. Enterohemorrhagic E. coli and Shigella, they are similar bacteria. They have very low infective dose. Why low infective dose? Because they are acid resistant. They are not killed by acid, unlike the other bacteria, right? So they reach the large intestine, small intestine, and if I magnify here, what happens? You can see there are many, you know the layers of the gut wall and all. I'm not getting into those details. I've just represented the mucosal epithelium and the submucosa over here. So the bacteria will enter into a mucosal cell, and by the means it will enter into the submucosa, where it is engulfed by the macrophage, right? And they burst outside. They also burst outside, infecting the mucosal cells. So this epithelial cells, which were invaded by the bacteria, starts producing cytokines, telling our body's immune system there is a bacteria inside. So automatically the immune system will start secreting, the inflammatory cells, which will come and cause inflammation of the gut wall, causing acute colitis. Itis meaning inflammation, and this is the main feature causing the bacillary dysentery. You will have blood in stool, right, because of this inflammatory response. So there is this bacteria which is acid resistant coming into the large intestine or small intestine. So let me just remove this. So there is a bacteria causing inflammation, causing acute colitis. The mucosal cells are impaired. It also get inside the submucosa. So let's get the mechanism in statement. So there is invasion due to the large virulence plasmid coding IPA protein and type 3 secretion system proteins. Because of this, there is invasion into the gut epithelium. And once it is inside the epithelium, it goes into the submucosa and it spreads from cell to cell. So there is cell to cell spread at the epithelium, mediated by ICSA protein by inducing actin polymerization. So, as actin is a muscular protein, right? It's a contractile protein. So it will help the bacteria, like this actin will attach into the tail of the, Shigella bacteria. And once it contracts, actually this can jump. The bacteria can jump from one cell to another cell. So basically, by the means of actin polymerization, coded by the ICS-A protein. This can cause cell-to-cell spread in the epithelium. Okay, so this already we have discussed these points in this diagram as well. Now they'll secrete both exotoxins and endotoxins, right? Exotoxins and endotoxins. The endotoxin can cause intestinal inflammation and ulceration causing shigellosis. Speaking about the exotoxin, we have Shigella enterotoxin and Shiga toxin. Shiga toxin was like our verocytotoxin, which we already discussed in the enterohemorrhagic E. coli. They'll inhibit protein synthesis by inhibiting peptide transferase enzyme, that is a 28S rRNA of the 60S ribosome. Shigella enterotoxin is of 1 and 2 type. Okay, all these points are already discussed, and I guess it's like easy for you to understand. And what are the clinical features of shigellosis? There is 1 to 4 days of incubation period. The initial phase, there are phases: initial phase, phase of dysentery, phase of complication, and Eccri's Eccri's syndrome, post-infectious phase. So initial phase is watery diarrhea. Then in the diarrhea, blood starts appearing with mucus. That is a phase of dysentery. Then in less than 5 year of people, 5 years age children, it can go to complication. The complication may be intestinal complication, metabolic complication, or Eccri's syndrome. Intestinal complication, there might be toxic megacolon, perforation, and rectal prolapse. Metabolic complication might be because of loss of lot of fluids. There will be dehydration, hyponatremia, hypoglycemia, and all those stuff. And Eccri's syndrome is actually the neurological manifestation of Shigella. So there will be encephalopathy, which is known as Eccri's syndrome. There will be confusion, dizziness, loss of orientation, all those factors contributing to this nervous involvement, encephalopathy. And there will be a post-infectious phase. Lab diagnosis. What do we take for diagnosis? We take the stool for sure. We'll take the stool, and we'll want to do a stool culture, right? For transporting the stool, we have to keep the bacteria intact, right? So we can diagnose them in the stool, and we should not allow the excess proliferation of the gut, normal commensals of the gut. If they are getting a chance, they will over multiply the Shigella bacteria, and finally we cannot diagnose Shigella. For that, we use a special transport media known as the Sachs buffered glyceryl saline broth. Please remember the name. And we finally take it to the lab in the transport media. We'll do a culture. We'll do the culture in DCA agar, in XLD agar, or Salmonella Shigella agar, that is SS agar. And if we do a gram stain, we'll get gram-negative bacilli. We know all that. And the family characteristic, it will be catalase positive, oxidase negative. We already know, so we can demonstrate it in the lab also. And for the toxin and gene, we can do ELISA and PSR. And we can do antimicrobial or antibiotic susceptibility testing, that is known as a disc diffusion test. Actually, it's nothing. We'll take a agar, blood agar, in which we'll culture this bacterium. We'll put a disc of antibiotic somewhere, and if the bacteria is able to grow near the disc, it means it is resistant to that antibiotic. Or if it is unable to grow over there, it means that it is susceptible or sensitive to that antibiotic. It is called disc diffusion test. This should be taught to you in general microbiology. Now, treatment or prevention, the drug of choice is ciprofloxacin, a fluoroquinolone. This is a drug of choice. And how can we prevent? There is no vaccine available for shigellosis. Even though we are trying, there is no vaccine available because of the large variation. And we can, by simple methods of hand hygiene and personal hygiene, we can prevent the fecal-oral route of transmission. So that was about Shigella, another important bacteria. Then we come into Klebsiella. Klebsiella pneumoniae is known as Friedlander's bacillus. It's known as Friedlander's bacillus. It's a normal commensal in human gut. And we are going to study about Klebsiella pneumoniae, but there is also Klebsiella oxytoca, and there is something known as Campylobacterium. So that is actually Klebsiella granulomatis, which we are not going to study here. So Klebsiella pneumoniae is the major one. So Klebsiella pneumoniae, it causes severe lobar pneumonia. Actually, the patients, most susceptible ones are the ones who are alcoholics, like who are chronic alcoholics and immunocompromised people. They can develop this infection very fast. They'll cause severe lobar pneumonia. And actually, there is a peculiar finding in the sputum. It is red, currant, jelly sputum. There is red, dark red, currant, jelly sputum in these people. suffering from severe lobar pneumonia caused by Klebsiella pneumoniae. It can cause UTI, it can cause neonatal meningitis, it can cause nosocomial infection. What do you mean by nosocomial infection? Hospital acquired infections, it can cause hospital acquired infection. It can also cause abscesses. And there are 2 points that you just need to remember. Klebsiella pneumoniae subspecies Osseinae can cause atrophic rhinitis. This is mentioned in your textbook. Klebsiella pneumoniae subspecies rhinoscleromatis can cause rhinoscleroma, growth in the nasal cavity. Lab diagnosis, you can see it is a gram-negative bacilli. You can see there are pink colonies formed. It's not blue, so it's gram-negative. It's also bacilli, right? And if you do the culture, they are Enterobacteriaceae. Most of them are lactose fermenters. So in McConkey agar we'll get pink lactose fermenting colonies. Actually, it's very mucoid, right? You can see thick colonies. So there are mucoid, dome-shaped, pink color colonies. Please remember this. Mucoid, dome-shaped, pink color colonies in the case of Klebsiella pneumoniae. You can do a string test. Actually, the string test is actually, you do it for cholera also. Like if we culture this bacteria, we put a small metallic spoon downwards. We try to take out the culture. You will get a thin thread. So this is a string test. It's positive for Vibrio cholerae also. Please remember that. It is also positive for Klebsiella pneumoniae. ICUT test, if you're doing, I stands for Intol, it's negative. C for citrate, it's positive. U for urease, it's positive. Then you have the triple sugar ion, which is T. Treatment is by ceftriaxone, or you can do an antibiogram. The earlier method was diffusion test. You can find which bacteria are sensitive, which antibiotics are sensitive for Klebsiella, which are resistant. So accordingly, you can use for your treatment. But what we commonly use is ceftriaxone, a cephalosporin, third generation cephalosporin. So that was all about Klebsiella. Now we have our final bacteria, Proteus. Final bacteria, Proteus. Actually, Proteus is pleomorphic. It can change its, shape. It shows a peculiar type of motility in blood agar. It's known as swarming motility. You can see Proteus colonies, it's swarming around. It's swarming around, so it causes a particular type of motility known as swarming motility, which is also shown by, Bacillus cereus and some other bacteria like Vibrio parahemolyticus and all those swarming motility, but mostly it is associated with bacteria like Proteus. And generally they'll have a fishy smell, fishy odor, and they're a very good urease producer. There is a very important feature associated with this point, that is, it is a very good urease producer. Actually, do you know which is the best urease producing bacteria? Which produces the maximum amount of urease? It's Helicobacter pylori. That is why even in the diagnostic test of Helicobacter pylori, the best method is a rapid urease test. Urea breath test or rapid urease test. And another good like urease producing bacteria is Proteus, but less than H. pylori. It's H2S positive. It produces hydrogen sulfide. Now, what happens because it's very good urease producer? It will convert urea into ammonia, right? Because of this, the urine becomes alkaline. The urine becomes alkaline. So when we were discussing about urinary antiseptics, there are antibiotics which act in UTI, in acidic urine, in alkaline urine, or independent of it. Independent was the best option. But since in Proteus, the urine is alkaline, we tend to use those antibiotics which are more effective in alkaline medium. Okay. So that is a point to be noted. The virulence factor, you can have flagellar or H antigen, you can have oversomatic antigen, that is a lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin. There are two major people we are going to study about, Proteus mirabilis and Proteus vulgaris. So they are opportunistic pathogens actually. They can cause hospital outbreaks. I told you there is urease present. Urease will convert urea into ammonia, which makes the urine alkaline. So once the urine is alkaline, the phosphate in urine will start precipitating and forming calculi. That's why Proteus forms struvite stones. It causes it causes calculi in bladder. Why is it causing? Because it produces urease. Urease converts urea into ammonia, making the urine alkaline. In alkaline urine, phosphate will precipitate. We have already studied this in this basic chemistry in 11th and 12th in equilibrium chapter of, if you remember. So it produces renal, it produces calculi in the bladder. It produces true white stones. Now, a rather important feature of Proteus, the antigens of Proteus, are used in a diagnostic test for another bacterium. The antigens of Proteus are used in the diagnosis of another bacterium. That reaction is known as Weil-Felix reaction for Rickettsia. Weil-Felix reaction or heterophile antibody test. Heterophile antibody test is used for rickettsial infection, but the antigen heterophile antigen test, the antigens used over there are the antigens of Proteus. We don't need to study it like in detail, but I've just added an image so that you should know the antigens of Proteus used are OXK, OX2, and OX19. And these are the various diseases caused by rickettsia, different species of rickettsia, and wherever the test will be positive and negative. I've just mentioned it. Just know that Weil-Felix reaction, the basis of reaction is they use an antigen from Proteus. That's why I use the term heterophile, right? And lab diagnosis, we have already studied the features. We can look for pleomorphism, we can look for fishy smell, we can look for swarming in blood agar. Urease will be positive. It produces H2S, so we can just find it. It is indole positive, and typing can be done by Dine's phenomenon. This Dine's phenomenon is pretty important, so we'll discuss it. So I've drawn a picture of Dine's phenomenon for you to easily comprehend it. So this is Dine's phenomenon. So you can see a blue, red, and gray, right? You can see blue, you can see red, you can see gray. These are the strains of Proteus I'm growing in a culture. So these are also grown in a culture. Now, if this are grown in a culture, they'll show swarming. There is no doubt in that. They'll show swarming motility. If all these three have grown belongs to the same strain, their swarmings will merge together, forming common swarming motions, right? Now, if they are different strains, they will have their own swarming. They will not merge with each other. So they are different strain. This phenomenon is known as Dine's phenomenon. So when two strains of Proteus are incubated at different areas of culture plate, if they are same strains, swarmings will merge. If they are different strains, swarming doesn't merge completely. You can see the line of demarcation of each swarming. So that is what is known as Dine's phenomenon. Now we complete the bacteria which were very important in the category of the family of Enterobacteriaceae. We have studied E. coli, we have studied Shigella, we have studied Proteus, and also we have studied Klebsiella. So E. coli being the most important out of all. Now yet to complete, we have Yersinia causing the plague, and we'll also have Salmonella, which is like typhoid and non-typhoid. That will be discussed in another video. So I hope you understood my class, and thank you for bearing with me for this time. Thank you.